Let's have a look at the inverse sine of x. This is about as tricky a question as you're going to get in differentiation. So let's give it a bash. There's a lot of algebra involved. Okay, so like the inverse tan, the log tables tells you d dx of the inverse sine of x over a is equal to a over the square root of 1 of a squared minus x squared. So that's in the log tables. Now unfortunately that's not very useful, because again we rarely get x over 2 or x over 3 or x over 4 in there. We usually get something simpler like x or something more complicated. So usually what we do is we let a equal 1. And we say when you differentiate the inverse sine of x, you get 1 over the square root of 1 minus x squared. And this is what we're going to use. This and a whole load of algebra. So let's start off. Dy dx is 1 over the square root of 1 minus this angle to be squared. So 2x over 1 minus x over root 1 minus x squared squared. Alright, so it's 1 minus 1 over x squared, so 1 minus 1 over the square root of 1 minus this thing squared. Now I have to multiply by the derivative of this, and once again we've got v times du dx minus u times dv dx all over v squared. Alright, so we have ourselves a quotient formula for that. So let's write down u and v. So u equals 2x, so du dx equals 2. V equals the square root of 1 minus x squared, which is 1 minus x squared to the power of 1/2 if I want to go differentiating. So dv dx, bring the power down the front, 1/2, 1 minus x squared to the power of minus 1/2, times the derivative of what's inside, so times a minus 2x. They cancel and they end up with minus x over the square root of 1 minus x squared. Alright, so let's fill that in and see where we are. So I get 1 now over the square root of 1 minus 4x squared over 1 minus x squared. That's what we get on the bottom. When you square the top line, square 2x and you get 4x squared. Square that square root and the square root disappears. And I have to multiply that by v, so square root of 1 minus x squared times du dx, which is 2, minus u, which is 2x, times dv dx, which is minus x over the square root of 1 minus x squared. The whole thing is over the square root of 1 minus x squared squared, v squared. Alright, there are a bunch of ways of going from here. We might consider these kind of separately, this here and this here. If we look at that, we can hopefully see that we should be able to turn that into one fraction. And then 1 over 1 fraction, if you remember, to divide by a fraction, you need to turn it upside down and multiply. You need to invert and multiply. So that might be one way, or it is one way, of approaching this. So to write this as one fraction, we need to think of this as number as 1 over 1. And we need to think of our common denominator is 1 minus x squared. For this fraction, for this little sum in here. So under that square root sign, I'm going to make both lines, bottom lines, the same. So 1 over 1, if I make the bottom line 1 minus x squared, I'm going to have to make the top line 1 minus x squared. Now I'll be able to put them into one fraction and then turn it upside down and multiply, because it's 1 over that answer. Over here, let's have a look. So we get 2 root 1 minus x squared. Minus by minus gives me plus 2x squared all over the square root of 1 minus x squared. And on the bottom line, I square the square root, which means I'm left with 1 minus x squared. Alright. So at this stage, we're actually quite a lot of the way there. Let's try and sort out the first one first there, I guess. So we've 1 over the square root of, they have the same bottom line, so it's 1 minus x squared. 1 minus x squared minus another 4x squared is 1 minus 5x squared. Okay. Now over here, again, there's two ways that we could deal with this. We could try and make this into one fraction and then kind of sort out the bottom lines, because we'd have two bottom lines then to deal with. Or we could maybe say that we could multiply top and bottom, so up here and down here, by this thing to get rid of the fraction. So maybe that's what we'll do up here. So 2 times the square root of 1 minus x squared. So we're multiplying the top line. I suppose we'll write in the whole top line first. So we're multiplying the whole top line here by the square root of 1 minus x squared. And in a second, we're going to multiply the bottom line by the same thing. Alright. So, back to the first bit here. This is 1 over a fraction, so we can turn the fraction upside down and multiply. So this is really 1 multiplied by 1 minus x squared all over 1 minus 5x squared. Okay, we can talk about the square root in a second if you're a bit dodgy on it. And then we're multiplying this whole thing. So that's really just that. The 1 doesn't make any difference, okay? So we multiply the square root by the square root. So you've root 1 minus x squared by root 1 minus x squared just gives me 1 minus x squared. So I get 2 into 1 minus x squared. So that's when I multiply this in here. And then I also need to multiply it in here. And when I multiply this by this fraction, the bottom line cancels with this. And I end up with plus 2x squared. That was the whole point of doing it. And on the bottom down here, I get 1 minus x squared by root 1 minus x squared. Okay, so we're nearly there. Over here, if you remember, you may or may not remember, that the square root of, let's say, 2/3 is the square root of 2 over the square root of 3. Okay, so what I can do is I can write this as the square root of 1 minus x squared over the square root of 1 minus 5x squared. Multiplying that, now multiply in here, and I get 2 minus 2x squared plus 2x squared. On the bottom here, I get 1 minus x squared times the square root of 1 minus x squared. Nearly there. So the bottom line is these three things multiplied together. The top line is this by this. Now you can see that this here is going to cancel very nicely with that there. So on the top, I am simply going to be left with 2 minus 2x squared plus 2x squared. So that's just 2. So I'm left with 2 over the square root of 1 minus 5x squared times 1 minus x squared. And that there is the answer. So there's quite a bit of algebra involved. The differentiation actually stopped here. There's just one line, well, kind of one line of differentiation. It's a long line. So for the differentiation part, what we need, actually, yeah, that's the differentiation. For the differentiation part, we use this form of it, with no a or anything. So it's just 1 over the square root of 1 minus the angle squared, however complicated the angle is, and we multiply by the derivative of the angle. And in this case, the angle was a fraction, so we did the quotient formula. Okay, what we did then, we had a look at this, we said let's make that one fraction on the bottom line. So we turn that into one fraction, so we get a common denominator, both things over the same. We turn it into one fraction, and then we turn that fraction upside down and multiply. So instead of 1 minus 5x squared over 1 minus x squared, we turn it upside down, so we get 1 minus x squared on the top, 1 minus 5x squared on the bottom. Okay, and then the square root of a quotient is the square root of the top line over the square root of the bottom line, so that's what we end up with here. On the right hand side, we had fractions inside the fractions, and we said we'll multiply top and bottom by this pesky bottom line that we don't want, so we multiply top and bottom by that, and we see what results. The reason we didn't multiply top and bottom back up here is that if you want to multiply the bottom by something, you have to multiply under a square root sign, and that's a very awkward thing to be doing. So it is easier generally to just write this as one fraction, turn upside down and multiply, than to be trying to multiply top and bottom by something to get rid of that bottom line, because that's going to be a pain in the ass. So we do that, and we end up with this down here. So there's a lot of algebra involved. Just on the whole, this is just kind of an aside. 1 divided by the square root of 1 minus 5x squared over 1 minus x squared is 1 divided by this fraction. So we could have brought the square roots into the top and bottom lines earlier, and now it should be clear that that is a fraction. That's the top line, that's the bottom line, and I can turn that upside down and get 1 multiplied by 1 minus x squared over 1 minus 5x squared. Okay. As to why you're allowed to take the square roots of the top, like the square root of a over b. The square root of a over b is the number that when I multiply it by itself will give me a over b. Right? So the definition of the square root of a over b is the number that when I square it, I get that. Now, if you take the square root of a over the square root of b and you square it, you multiply it by itself, and you think how are fractions multiplied? Well, fractions multiply top by top, so root a by root a is a, bottom by bottom, root b by root b is b. So this thing, root a over root b, has to be the same as the square root of a over b. When you square this thing, you get a over b. When you square this thing, you get, so these are the same. This and this are the same thing. And that's pretty much it.